Hello, welcome back to MOOC course on Environmental Humanities. In the previous lecture, we talked about the various aspects of environmental humanities, that how we can approach it as an academic discipline. Now, today we will talk about the text, how environment is related to text. So, it is going to be the discussion on literature as well as environment, which is an important component of environmental humanities. I must also remind you once again that whenever we are talking about things here in environmental humanities discussion, this is not in isolation to what you already know about literature, what you know already about other disciplines that will be discussed in future lectures. You have that schema, that you have that prior knowledge. Make use of it in decoding what is being said here. So you can bring on the information, the knowledge, the understanding that you have about literature as a discipline, and it's going to be very instrumental in understanding its connection with environmental humanities and how it is very important component of environmental humanities. As I said in my previous lecture, that it is one of the important pillars of environmental humanities. So here we go. Now we will look at how eco-criticism, that is, reading the world through a green lens. You have heard this term eco-criticism, which is made up of two words, that is ecology and criticism. Criticism is a field of literature and ecology is a word that comes from environmental discussions. So if environmental humanities is a broad interdisciplinary field, eco-criticism is one of its most influential literary branches. The term gained prominence in the 1990s through scholars such as Cheryl Glotfelty and Lawrence Buell. Eco-criticism emerged from a simple but revolutionary question. How does literature represent the environment? Now that's a very interesting question. It appears very simple, but it has so many layers of decoding and understanding. Because on a surface level, we have read so many poems and so many texts in literature where the description of a character's state of mind is depicted through nature, the imagery of nature, the actual symbols of nature, the words related to nature and environment. This kind of thing has always existed, and this has also been underlined as an important style of creating literature. But does it only remain at that level? Does it do something else? Is it something more than just the connection of human emotions being represented through the jargon of nature and environment? If you look at poems like Thyrsis, where so many flowers, so many beautiful components of university campus have been documented in one poem by a friend who is missing, his lost friend, his dead friend, what kind of work this poem is doing. So there are so many other examples, so many kinds of looking at this question. It is not simply about a linear representation of environment through language, through discussions, through symbols, imagery. You need to talk of it at various levels. You can choose your own direction, but let's talk about it in more complex way. So for much of literary history, critical attention focused primarily on human relationships. Literary critics analyzed class, gender, race, nationalism, colonialism, and psychology. So these are some more dominant traits that we see in the interpretation of literature that happen around us. So eco-critics ask this question, but what about nature? Where is the environment in our literary interpretations? How do texts shape ecological consciousness. Eco-criticism shifts attention from exclusively human concerns towards more than human relationships. It examines how landscapes influence narratives, how animals function within stories, how environmental destruction is represented, how cultural assumptions about nature become embedded in language. One influential eco-critical insight concerns the role of setting of a scene, the depiction. Traditionally, settings were often treated as passive backgrounds. Eco-criticism argues that environments actively shape events. Consider Thomas Hardy's Wessex, Emily Bronte's Moors, Amitav Ghosh's Sundarbans, or Ruskin Bond's Himalayan landscapes. In each case, environment influences characters, conflict, and meaning. The landscape becomes an active participant. Eco-criticism also investigates language. Language is never neutral. When forests are described as timber reserves, rivers are described as water resources, or animals as stocks, particular assumptions become normalized. Language can either obscure or reveal ecological relationships. An important contribution comes from Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence. So many environmental harms occur gradually, not immediately. Climate change, toxic contamination, groundwater depletion, biodiversity loss, they unfold over long periods because they lack dramatic visibility. They often escape public attention. Literature can make such invisible processes visible. Eco-criticism therefore reveals how narratives influence environmental awareness. It demonstrates that literary texts are not merely reflections of ecological realities. They are active participants in shaping ecological thought. So, what happens when we look at environment as a text? That is the decoding the meaning of landscapes. So, it is a fascinating idea in environmental humanities that the landscapes can be read as texts. At first, this may sound strange. How can a river be a text? How can a forest be a text? How can a city be a text? Yet, when we think carefully, the idea becomes surprisingly intuitive. Just as texts contain meanings, histories, symbols, and narratives, landscapes also embody layers of significance. Imagine standing beside a river. What do you see? You might observe water, but you might also observe industrial pollution, religious practices, tourism, agricultural dependence, urban development, climate impacts, and historical transformations. The river becomes a repository of stories. Environmental humanities teaches us to read these stories. This approach draws upon cultural geography, anthropology, literary studies, and environmental history. Landscapes are understood as archives. Every landscape bears traces of human and non-human interactions. A forest may reveal histories of colonial extractions. A city may reveal histories of industrialization. An agricultural field may reveal histories of labor, technology, and ecological changes. Environmental humanities, therefore, treats places as texts requiring interpretation. Another important concept here is climate as narrative. Climate is often presented as scientific data. Environmental humanities asks how climate is experienced, remembered, narrated, and culturally understood. Different societies tell different climate stories. Monsoon, droughts, floods, and storms become embedded within folklore, religion, literature, and collective memory. The concept of more than human agency further expands this perspective. Traditional humanist thought often assumes that only humans possess agency. Environmental humanities challenges this assumption. Animals, rivers, microbes, weather systems, and ecosystems influence events in significant ways. The COVID-19 pandemic dramatically demonstrated how non-human entities can shape human history. Thus, reading landscapes becomes an exercise in recognizing complex networks of agency and meaning. Now, what about stories? We talk about texts, places, landscapes. Now, the stories. Narrative in the face of ecological crisis. Now, why do stories matter in an age dominated by scientific reports and technological solutions? Who doesn't want to read stories? Who doesn't want to listen to stories? Human nature is all about listening to stories. Environmental humanities offers a compelling answer. Human beings understand the world through narratives. Stories organize experience. Stories shape our memory. Stories create meaning. Stories influence behavior. Climate change presents a unique communication challenge. Its causes are dispersed. We need to talk about it in different ways. Its impacts unfold over long time scales. So if it is about 400 years, 200 years, 70 years, how are we going to, talk about these time scales? The consequences often appear abstract. As a result, many people struggle to emotionally connect with climate science. When we talk of 400 years ago, this happened, it looks like a data. But stories help bridging that gap. Narratives transform abstract data into a lived experience. A novel can reveal the human consequences of rising sea levels. For example, if a novel is written about human beings living in the coastal regions and it's a story of, let us say, 70 years, 80 years, 100 years, that narrative can make us understand the whole situation. A film can make biodiversity loss emotionally tangible. A poem can capture ecological grief more powerfully than a scientific graph. Amitav Ghosh argues that contemporary literature often struggles to represent climate change because traditional narrative forms evolved around assumptions of environmental stability. Environment is not stable. Those narratives are formed, these traditional ones are formed on those assumptions of stability. But because our timeline, our age, our memory is limited, if we only talk about what we see in one lifetime, it is not going to help. What about before and after? What happens before we were born? What happens after we die? In that same area, in that same mountain, in that same river. So that kind of assumption of stability is not going to suffice. Today, environmental instability demands new storytelling practices. Environmental humanities, therefore, studies climate fiction, eco-poetry, environmental cinema, documentaries, indigenous storytelling, and digital narratives. Stories also cultivate empathy. Through narrative, readers can imaginatively inhabit perspectives beyond themselves. Some environmental texts invite readers to imagine the experiences of animals, forests, rivers, and future generations. Such imagination and such imaginative engagement can create ethical responsibility, can lead to ethical sensitization. Stories further challenge dominant narratives of progress. Modern societies often celebrate endless economic growth. Environmental narratives question whether growth without ecological limits is sustainable. So they propose alternative visions emphasizing care, resilience, reciprocity, and sustainability. Ultimately, environmental humanities views storytelling not as entertainment only, but as a vital ecological practice. Stories help societies imagine environmental futures. And before societies can create better futures, they must first imagine them. So, the Eco Close Reading Toolkit. How to read. So far in this lecture, we have explored some of the foundational concepts of environmental humanities. Up till now, in the discussions of these lectures, the Anthropocene, the environmental imagination, ecological traditions, and eco-criticism. However, a crucial question remains. How do we actually apply these ideas when reading a literary text, film, landscape, or cultural artifact? So, I'm going to talk about eco-close reading process. So, these are a set of critical questions that help us uncover the ecological dimensions of texts and cultural representations. Close reading has long been a cornerstone of literary studies. As I said that your knowledge of literature already that you have is going to be of consequence in this discussion. So you know about close reading. Traditionally, close reading focused on language, symbolism, characterization, imagery, and narrative structure. Environmental humanities expands this by introducing ecological concerns into interpretation. The first question we ask is the environment merely a backdrop or a dynamic force? In many traditional readings, landscapes function merely as settings. A forest is simply where events occur. A river merely provides scenery. A mountain serves as a picturesque background. Eco-critical reading challenges this assumption. We ask whether the environment actively influences characters, actions, and outcomes. For example, in The Hungry Tide by Amitav Ghosh, the Sundarbans are not simply a location. The tides, rivers, storms, mangrove forests, and ecological unpredictability profoundly shape human lives and narrative developments. Similarly, in Shakespeare's King Lear, the storm is not merely meteorological, it reflects psychological and political disorder. Environmental humanities teaches us to notice how environments possess agency. The second question concerns resources versus kinship. How does the text portray non-human beings? Are forests represented merely as timber, as wood? Are animals represented merely as commodities? Or are they represented as fellow beings with intrinsic value? This distinction reveals underlying environmental ethics. Many indigenous narratives describe animals, rivers, and mountains as relatives rather than resources. Modern industrial narratives often reduce nature to economic utility. By examining these representations, we uncover the values embedded within texts. The third question is about environmental justice. Who benefits from environmental transformation and who suffers? Environmental damage is rarely distributed equally. Industrial pollution often affects marginalized communities disproportionately. You must have seen pictures of how slum areas are located near the nalas and drains where the industrial output flows, the industrial waste flows, the harmful chemicals flow. Climate change impacts vulnerable populations more severely than affluent groups. And eco-critical reading therefore investigates power relationships. When we read a text, we must ask whose voices are present, whose experiences are ignored, whose sufferings remain invisible. Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence is particularly relevant here. Many environmental harms unfold gradually over decades. Toxic contamination, groundwater depletion, biodiversity loss, and climate change often lack dramatic visibility. Literature can reveal these hidden forms of violence. Another important question concerns metaphor. Environmental metaphors often reveal cultural assumptions. For example, consider phrases such as conquering nature, taming the wilderness, natural resources, virgin forests. Such language carries ideological implications. It reflects particular ways of imagining human relationships with nature. So, environmental humanities teaches us to pay close attention to these linguistic choices. And finally, we ask about the future. What ecological future does the text imagine? Collapse, adaptation, resilience, coexistence, restoration. Texts do not simply represent the present, they also project possible futures. Environmental humanities encourages us to examine these future imaginaries critically. With the help of these questions, close reading becomes ecological reading. We learn to recognize the environmental dimensions that often remain hidden beneath the surface of the narratives. In doing this, literature becomes more than aesthetic expression. It becomes a powerful tool for environmental understanding. Now, talking of observing and interpreting local environments. One of the most exciting aspects of environmental humanities is that it encourages us to move beyond books and classrooms. Environmental humanities is not merely something we study, it is something we practice. This discussion you can see here is introducing a fundamental environmental humanities exercise, learning to observe and interpret local environments. The process first must begin with observation. Most people move through environments without truly noticing them. We walk through streets while looking at our phones. We pass trees without identifying them. We hear birds without listening. We inhabit environments while remaining strangely disconnected from them. Environmental humanities invites us to slow down, to pay attention, to become careful observers. Imagine standing in a familiar location on your campus, in your locality, perhaps near a canteen, a pathway, a garden, or an open field. What do you notice? What sounds dominate? Bird calls, traffic, construction noise, human conversations, silence? What smells are present? What plants grow there? What signs of environmental change are visible? Observation is only the first step. The second step is interpretation. Environmental humanities asks us to read places as cultural texts. Every landscape tells stories. A drying pond may tell a story about groundwater extraction. A polluted river may reveal histories of industrialization. A disappearing tree canopy may reflect urban expansion. An abundant field may reveal economic transformations. Places contain narratives. The task of environmental humanities is to uncover them. The task of the environmental humanities is to uncover them. This exercise also encourages us to think historically. No landscape is static, that it will remain same forever. Every environment has a history. Ask yourself, what did this place look like 50 years ago, 100 years ago? How has it changed? Who shaped those changes? What forces contributed to them? Historical thinking transforms observation into environmental understanding. Another important aspect concerns narrative. After observing and interpreting, we construct narratives. We tell stories about places. This process is not merely descriptive, it is analytical. By narrating environmental change, we begin to understand relationships between ecology, culture, politics, and history. And finally comes reflection. Reflection requires us to examine our own position with environmental systems. We are not detached observers. We participate in the very process we study. Our consumption patterns, transportation choices, lifestyles, and institutional affiliations all influence environmental outcomes. Environmental humanities therefore combines observation with self-reflection. It encourages us to recognize that environmental problems are not distant phenomena. They are woven into everyday life. The purpose of this exercise, therefore, is not simply to generate information, it is to cultivate environmental awareness, to develop ecological attentiveness, to learn how to see. Of course, we know what to see, but how to see, because meaningful environmental action often begins with learning to notice what has long been overlooked. So, in the lectures to follow, what we will be discussing is visible on your screen right now. A kind of a brief roadmap is here. We have discussed the foundations of environmental humanities. We have discussed the definition. We have discussed why it is important. Now, what are we going to do in the future lectures? Each module represents a different pathway into understanding environmental issues that through the lens of the humanities. First destination is the historical development of environmental thought. Environmental concerns did not suddenly emerge in 21st century. Ideas about nature have evolved across centuries. We will explore how different societies imagined human relationships with the non-human world and how those ideas continue to shape contemporary environmental debates. Next, we will move into the environmental literature and eco-criticism. Here we will examine how literary texts represent nature, environmental change, ecological conflict, and multi-species relationships. We will encounter writers from different cultural contexts and explore how literature contributes to environmental understanding. The course will then examine media and environmental communication. In today's world, environmental awareness is profoundly influenced by cinema, television, journalism, digital platforms, social media, and visual culture. So, how are environmental crises represented? How do media shape public perception? How do environmental narratives circulate globally? These questions will guide our discussions. Another major focus will be on environmental ethics. Scientific knowledge can explain environmental problems. Ethics helps us evaluate our responsibilities. Do future generations possess rights? Do animals deserve moral consideration? Should ecosystems be protected for their own sake? These questions lie at the heart of environmental philosophy. So the course will examine and engage with the environmental justice, environmental harms not being experienced equally, questions of race, class, gender, caste, colonialism, and inequality will intersect with the environmental issues in complex ways. Environmental humanities therefore provide powerful tools for understanding these intersections. So it is not merely an academic subject, it is an intellectual framework that encourages critical thinking about some of the most pressing challenges facing contemporary societies. So this course will invite you not only to acquire knowledge, but also to cultivate new ways of thinking, new ways of seeing, and perhaps even new ways of living. So you can do this kind of thing. How we began, why do we need? The answer, I hope, is now clear. This is a summation of those kinds of things. It is a cultural problem, ethical problem, historical problem, political problem, above all, a problem of imaginations. Scientific knowledge is very important for us. So we have to keep these things in mind. The most important concept to carry forward from the discussion so far is that of ecological citizenship. Traditionally, citizenship has been understood primarily in political terms. Citizens possess rights and responsibilities within a nation state. Environmental humanities expands this concept. Ecological citizenship recognizes that human beings belong not only to political communities but also to ecological communities. So we are members of ecosystems, participants in planetary processes, dependents upon countless humans and non-human relationships. Every breath we take depends upon forests, oceans, plants, and atmospheric systems. Every meal depends upon soils, waters, pollinators, ecological networks. Our lives are deeply entangled with the more than human world. Ecological citizenship therefore requires a different kind of ethical awareness. It asks us to think beyond individual interests, beyond immediate gratification, beyond short term gains. It encourages us to consider future generations, other species, distant communities, shared planetary futures. Environmental humanities ultimately seeks to cultivate this expanded ethical imagination. It asks us to move beyond seeing ourselves as masters of nature. Instead, it encourages us to recognize ourselves as participants within a vast web of life. This shift may appear philosophical, but its implications are profoundly practical. The way we imagine our relationship with nature influences how we act, and how we act influences the future of the planet. The environmental challenges of the 21st century demand not only technological innovation, but also cultural transformation. Not only new policies, but new stories. Not only new scientific expertise, but ethical wisdom. Not only economic development, but ecological responsibilities. The humanities play a crucial role in this transformation. They help us ask deeper questions, imagine alternative futures, and cultivate the empathy, imagination, ethical reflection necessary for living responsibility in a changing world. So I invite you to approach environmental humanities not simply as an academic subject, but as a way of seeing the world, a way of listening to landscapes, a way of reading stories, a way of understanding interconnectedness, and perhaps the most importantly, a way of imagining more just sustainable and compassionate futures for all forms of life. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to our discussions together. These are some of the things that you can read further on. Thank you.